Hello, students. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to my very brief introductory lecture to Imani Perry's book, Breathe, A Letter to My Sons. This was published just in the last year, and I just wanted to spend a few minutes for our asynchronous class offering some guiding suggestions, some orientation to this book, and some suggestions for topics you might consider writing on for your discussion post today. So, when Imani Perry entitled her book Breathe, I read in an interview, as many people guessed, she was thinking of Eric Garner's dying repetition, I can't breathe. But she was also thinking about her own days sleeping with an oxygen tank when her lupus was flaring up badly. She lives with chronic illness. She was born in Birmingham, Alabama, an industrial city that at the time had the worst air quality of any place in the U.S. And her disease are consequences of that air. But despite all that, she said in the interview, and I think we get from the first half of the book, even that you read for today, she, in this book, wanted to remind her two sons, her children, to all children, as she put it, to breathe deeply where we can, to hold on to some sort of sustenance. It's at once a necessity for life and a form of refusal. So I think really the central question of Perry's book is, how do you instill enough self-love or even enough breath, enough ability to breathe deeply, enough self-love in your children that it will buoy them when racial hatred threatens to pull them under? So this is the challenge for parents, particularly of Black children, and this is the aim of Breathe. And I think, like all the thinkers we've encountered so far this semester, Imani Perry too has, very little patience with mainstream institutions, dominant narratives that have served to fuel such cruelty in our world. And it's not just the white racists that she's talking about in her book, but even sympathetic liberals from whom she regularly hears things like, and this is a quote from the book, "It must be terrifying to raise a Black boy in America." She says, thinking of, speaking in her community. She lives in Princeton, New Jersey, with white people. Without hesitation, she writes, they speculate as if it's a statement of fact. I look into their wide eyes. I see them hungry for my suffering, or crude with sympathy, or grateful that they are not in such a circumstance. And it isn't that she doesn't want white people to care about Black suffering, but her point is, would you stop sort of pleading innocence, looking for our suffering, mining for our suffering, your appetite to hear details of Black suffering, and express your sympathy and just do something about it? But educating, white people is really not the main aim of Perry's book. Breathe centers on Black endurance. Her book offers her own kids sort of this sustaining, animating matrix of history, of ancestry, compassion, and the offerings that she puts together, I think, like many of our thinkers this semester, reach tentatively, cautiously, but certainly it reaches for some religious language, religious materials, some of which, but not all of which, come out of Perry being raised in the Black Catholic traditions of the South. So she's trying to offer up the gifts of life, resilience, breath, not fear or helplessness. She says in the book to her sons, I cannot clip your wings. No, I want your wingspan wide. She writes of learning from a Zen priest. So there's like some religious eclecticism in here that I think are very reminiscent of the Black freethinkers tradition. But she says the words of a Zen priest who speaks of freeing oneself of the white mind, of its overwhelming method of seeing and interpreting as a means of getting closer to the truth. Breathe models other forms of practices. She talks about ancestors sort of keeping generations alive, keeping this inheritance of endurance alive generation after generation. She also on page, I'll be curious, what else you see in the book, but on page 4 and 5, she talks about grace. This life we have is grace. She says on page 5, in the Catholic tradition, there's a form of grace, the sanctifying one, that is the stuff of your soul. It is not defined by moments of mercy or opportunity. It's not good things happen to you. Rather, it is the good thing that is in you, regardless of what happens. You carry this down through the generations, same as the epigenetic trauma of violent slave master society, but the grace is the bigger part. It is what made the ancestors hold on so that we could become. So throughout this book, there's this sort of, she's giving contours of this inner stuff of resilience and breath. Some of it is religious, not all of it. She talks about on 102 a little bit about this sort of eclectic religious sensibility. On page 131, prayers she makes to the altar, to this altar, combining some indigenous African traditions with her Catholicism, and also why she isn't raising her children in the Catholic Church. So, one idea for your discussion post is I'd like you to think about what is the content of this life, this grace, this breath she wants to offer for her sons. What interests you about it? Do you think this is something just uniquely on offer for Black children? Is there something that stretches beyond that particular community? Is there something universal in what she's talking about? Or is it primarily particularistic? What do you think of the content of breath? Another idea might be for you to discuss on the discussion post. What do you make of her interpretation of religion, of spirituality? What is it? What do you think of it? Is it compelling? Um, is it something people might learn from? The promises, the perils, advantages, disadvantages of her approach? Um, Another thing I think that would be interesting to talk about in your discussion post or perhaps on Monday is something that you see a lot in Black literature talking about sort of the white American addiction to innocence. So on page 120, she says, Americans are addicted to innocence. That is part of its parsimoniousness with respect to democracy. They are never held to account, like the child with donut crumbs around her mouth, who is so cute we pretend to believe she didn't swallow the sugar. That's on page 120. And what does Perry mean there about this innocence and being parsimonious in regard to democracy? What does she mean? What do you think of that? And finally, I wonder also, were there other sentences from the book that just personally resonated with you? Why? Were there any particular passages from Breathe that kind of piqued your curiosity, expanded your way of thinking, or even challenged you? So, for class, I'd like you to write about a paragraph or so on the discussion post about this book. You might use my questions as potential guides, and I'll respond to each of you. You might even today, since we're all free at class time, do it during class time. If you need to get out of the house, you're sick of being home, you could go into the classroom at 2:30 and just do your discussion post, listen to my little lecture video, finish up your reading, and let me know what you're thinking. It's going to be a nice and empty space in Duane. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the first half of the book and speaking with each of you in class on Monday, and we'll talk about the rest of the book. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for your time. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.